Greetings all, and welcome to the third and final part in the 1/72nd scale KP Models Mig-15 build video. In today's video, we're going to finish off the model with a little bit of weathering, and at the end I'll give a little review on this kit. So without further ado, let's get into it. I would be skipping the metal chipping on this aircraft since the plane was painted in a bare metal finish, so it would be a little bit pointless to do that. I instead moved straight on to adding some panel liner to create some dirt and grime build-up effects and also some streaking effects. I applied it first in a very thick coat over the entire wing on both the upper and lower surfaces, and for the fuselage I applied it mainly in the areas where there were recessed panel details that I'd scribed. I also applied the panel liner quite heavily onto any of the access ports and filler caps, especially on the wings for the fuel, and also leading away from the speed brake and the rudder. The tail also received a pretty heavy dousing on the front areas, and the landing gear bays on the inside and streaking back from behind them received a pretty heavy coat. Once the panel liner had been applied and left to dry for a few hours, I then got a cotton tip and some of the Tamiya enamel thinners to remove the excess and tone down the effect. I use a rubbing motion to remove the panel liner, occasionally streaking it backwards in the direction air would flow over the wings to create the impression of leaks and streaks. This is especially focused on areas such as the fuel filler caps and on the control surfaces where leaks are likely to occur or visible streaking will be. As well as the wings, I applied this same technique onto the fuselage sides, mainly to remove the excess panel liner from the center of panels and help the panel liner further flow into the various recessed panels, creating the impression of a lot of dirt and grime building up over time and the aircraft not really being washed or cared for that well. I streaked it backwards also over the tail to create some more leaks and streaks, as well as on the underside of the wing. I kept a little bit of extra panel liner leading away from the landing gear, where you can see a fair bit of grease on a lot of aircraft over time. To build up the streaks a little bit more and add some much thinner areas, I used some enamel XF1 flat black from Tamiya to apply a little bit more of the streaking effect backwards from the leading edges of the control surfaces, the fuel tanks, and on some of the other areas I've previously mentioned. Once I'd applied these thinner streaks, coming back from the areas where they would be starting to the areas where they were fading, I then used some enamel thinners to once again thin them out and soften the effect by dragging them backwards in the same direction they were applied to thin the paint out and create the effect of the streaks occurring as the aircraft is flying through the air. Typically I'll use Vallejo or Tamiya water-based paints for my aircraft, but for this kit I use the aerosols. However, because I'd applied a layer of varnish over the top of them, it meant that the enamel thinners weren't going to interact with them, which meant that I could use this technique. Once I'd softened the technique and made the aircraft's weathering a little bit more reasonable, I then applied a little bit of a wash to highlight the details on the canopy, since I'd seen a lot of MiGs have some weathering up here and some highlighted rivet details. I then removed the excess and moved on to adding some of the Tamiya weathering powders. I used some of the lighter and brown weathering powders to create some dirt effects in the cracks between the recessed panels and also to create some extra streaking effects from the fuel system. To do this, I use a fine brush and using a little bit of water activate the weathering powders, dab them onto the areas where I want them, and then remove the excess with a damp cotton bud. I also used the weathering powders to create some heavy leaks on the drop tanks from refueling, and also to darken up the exhaust at the rear of the aircraft and add the last few of the fine streaks to some of the access hatches. I used the rust effects on the tyre rims since they seem to get a little bit of rust built up, and also in some of the areas leading away from the undercarriage where the grease would be. I also used them to darken some of the panels on the underside where the cannons are, which based on my reference photos in most of the MiGs appear to be a lot darker and more of a flat finish. Speaking of the cannons, at this point I create my replacement for the questionable one from the plastic kit out of some floral wire by cutting away the rubber tubing and using it as a cannon since it has a nice little hole in it. I use some Deluxe Materials odorless CA glue to glue it into place, and then I also use a spare section with some of the metal wire exposed to create a better pitot tube on the end of the wing. To create the anti-slip walkway for the pilots, I painted the wing area X24 dark grey based on the reference photos of the plane at the museum. I made sure to do it pretty sloppily to create a nice chipped effect. I also then used some extra copper wire to glue on the landing gear indicators on the wings, and while they were drying applied a second coat of X24 dark grey, taking care to scratch it up as I painted it. I then painted the gear indicators vermilion red, used a little bit of some mirror packaging to create the landing light on the front of the MiG, and with that, the model was finally completed. And here you can see a few photos of the finished kit and also a couple of pictures and videos of it alongside its real-life 1:1 scale counterpart at the Queensland Air Museum in Caloundra. So on the whole, I found this kit surprisingly pleasant despite a lot of shortcomings. The flash and the ejector pin marks were absolutely appalling and took a long time to clean up, but once I'd done that, the fit of the parts was pretty good. The detail inside the cockpit is also really nice, all things considered. The raised panel lines are pretty standard for the era of this kit, and to be honest, I liked them enough to keep them rather than sand them down. And despite the terrible instructions, I managed to build something that looks partway like a Mig-15 or the license-built aircraft number 2 if you're Polish. There's definitely a lot of areas I want to improve on from this kit, the main one being the panel scribing, which, as you can see, makes this aircraft look like Babushka was a little bit too heavy-handed when she was hammering the boilerplate to shape. I am, however, very happy with how my Tamiya aerosol painting turned out. The layer's nice and thin, there doesn't seem to be any imperfections, and I'm also really happy with how the hand painting of the Vallejo varnish turned out, because there's no real visible brushstrokes or any lumpy, weird imperfections from doing it that way. I'll definitely be trying this in the future, and I might also try some other experiments to see if I can get some better panel variety. It's a bit of a shame the Mig-15 as a two-seater version in 1/72nd scale doesn't seem to be very common, at least in Australia. If you can get a hold of the KP Models tooled one, I definitely recommend having a go. Despite its many shortcomings, you can clean it up and build a pretty nice kit out of it, in my opinion. It is possible that a company called Smear is still producing them. According to Scale Mates, they have the same tooling. Eduard also do a two-seater version in 72nd scale, although again, I think, at least in Australia, it's a bit of a tough kit to get. However, their single-seat version is relatively easy to get here, and it's an absolutely amazing kit, so I definitely recommend that one as well. And speaking of single-seater MiGs, I also have the Airfix 2009 tooled version of the Mig-15, or at least minus the instructions and decals that I picked up. So if people are interested in this video and want to see me build that one, definitely let me know. But that's all I have to say on the KP Mig-15, other than it's not a bad build as long as you spend the time cleaning it up and making a few modifications here and there. And I'm very happy to have a replica of the Queensland Air Museum's Mig-15 or license-built aircraft number 2. Thank you very much for having a watch of this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like. And if you have any suggestions or quips, leave them down in the comment section below. And a big shout out to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund these videos and continuing my modelling and animation works. It really helps every little bit. And a massive shout out to the Queensland Air Museum down in Caloundra. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend you go check it out. And also Tectonic Hobbies, the local store on the Sunshine Coast. We don't have, obviously, the old KP model MiG anymore, but there are many other MiGs and other kits, such as the ones behind me, that you can grab and have a build if you're into scale models. That's it for now, but until the next video, model on!